Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this event. Now, so the microphone's fine. That's all right for you? Yeah. Okay. We are filming this. It'll end out on YouTube in the next few days. Nā mai piki mai haere mai. Ko Naomi Johnson, toko ingoa, ko Beth Shalom, toko whare karakia. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to our meeting. My name is Naomi Johnson. Beth Shalom is my place of spiritual grounding and where we are tonight. Thank you for coming and a warm welcome to all. We were now going to have a karakia by given by Ashley Kingston Daniels, and she's unfortunately not well. And a number of you who go to interfaith events will remember the late Steve Daniels, and she is his daughter. And so we've been really keen that she could carry on the work of her father. And she's quite disappointed not to be here. So instead, we've got a Jewish prayer from our prayer book for interfaith meetings. Power of all creation, we stand in awe before you, impelled by visions of human harmony. We are the children of many traditions, inheritors of shared wisdom and tragic misunderstandings, of proud hope and humble successes. Now it is time for us to meet in memory and truth, in courage and trust, in love and promise. In that which we share, let us see the common prayer of humanity. In that which we differ, let us wonder at human freedom. In our unities and our differences, let us recognise the uniqueness of every being. May our courage match our convictions and our integrity match our hope. May our faith in you bring us closer to each other. May our meeting with past and present bring blessings for the future. Amen. So as we start, I'd like to, this event has been organised by the Children of Abraham. So we just happen to be hosting it, but the Children of Abraham is a group that is made up of the Pearl of the Islands Foundation, whose idea it actually was, and then we have the Holy Trinity Cathedral and Beth Shalom. And this is our fifth, I think, get together. It's the second time we have held such a gathering here, and we have an annual interfaith meeting. So I'd like to call on Tayaba Khan to introduce Associate Professor Zulea Keskin. Thank you, Tayaba.
Thank you, Naomi. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. It is my absolute pleasure to be introducing Associate Professor Zulea Keskin. Zulea is Associate Head of School at the Centre of Islamic Studies and Civilization at Charles Sturt University. She's also a lecturer in Islamic spirituality. Zulea is the co-founder of Isra Academy, the managing editor of the Australian Journal of Islamic Studies, and president of Australian Association of Islamic and Muslim Studies. Zulea completed her Master of Arts in Islamic Studies at the University of Sydney, writing her thesis on interfaith dialogue from an Islamic perspective. She completed her PhD at the Australian Catholic University. She went on to publish her thesis as a book, which is titled Attaining Inner Peace in Islam, Sayyid Nursi's Perspective. Zuleha's community outreach is through frequent requests like these ones, like this one tonight, to do Islamic talks on issues of the wider community. She has more than 20 years of experience in teaching to a range of audience. Welcome, Zulea.
And now to call up. And now I'd like to call up Reverend Alexa Gregory to introduce Archdeacon Michael Berry.
Kia ora koutou, shalom haverim, assalamu alaikum. Nice greetings from Holy Trinity Cathedral. Archdeacon Michael Berry began his ministry year 2003. He had experience of pastoral work in parish and also as a full-time chaplain in Royal New Zealand Navy, and is still active member of the Naval Reserve today, so beware. He values diversity of faith expressions in our Anglican Diocese of Auckland, and as such also values quite a lot interfaith dialogue and diversity that comes out of it. Michael lives in Royal Oak with Rebecca, his wife, who is also here with us and whom I also wish to acknowledge, and their two daughters. As a family person, he enjoys cooking, drinking coffee, spending time with family and friends, and of course spending time with children, especially on Saturdays when they need support with sports activities. As an archdeacon, he also does a few other things in our diocese. He is Bishop's Executive Chaplain, Deputy Vicar General, and chairs something what he thinks it's not important, but it is the Faculties Committee. So if you wish to put any picture anywhere in the cathedral or church, Michael will have to give his permission. So thank you for that.
Sounds like you're a very powerful man. It is my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Dean Shapiro. Rabbi Dean serves as the rabbi of this synagogue, and we believe we're so lucky that he has chosen to come back to us for a second time. He teaches adults and children, leads services, and provides pastoral care with intelligence and warmth. Rabbi Dean was ordained by Hebrew Union College in the USA, and in addition to serving as our rabbi here, first from 2008 to 2011, and returning here in 2021, he was the senior rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in Phoenix, Arizona. While there, Rabbi Dean served on the board of the Jewish Free Loan Association, was a Global Justice Fellow with the American Jewish World Service, and participated actively in his local interfaith clergy organisation. I have to say I googled those organisations to see what they were, and they're not just Jewish organisations, they are altruistic organisations that are helping people all over the world. Rabbi Dean is a mentor to other clergy through the Climate Ambassadors Training Program of Blessed Tomorrow. So welcome to our three speakers. So now I'll just give an outline about how we're going to proceed. The panel discussion will explore the religious practices relating to our life cycle events for our respective faiths. Each panellist has 3 to 5 minutes to respond, and if needed, boss lady here will raise a bell at 4 minutes and again at 5 minutes. Rabbi Dean knows I could be a bit bossy.
I hope you will ring the bell.
So we are going to start. The first question, and I'm going to ask Zulair to be the first speaker. Please describe the significant religious practices relating to a newborn child.
Okay, thank you. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. Can you all hear me well? Is my time started?
It's started.
That's fine. This is probably the question where there's a few things. So I've got a bit of to-do list here of rituals when a child is born. So I'll probably use up 5 minutes for this potentially. So when a child is born, there are a number of things that are actually done. One of them is the calling of what we call the adhan, which is the call to prayer into the ear of the newborn. Obviously, this is done in a way that's gentle for the ear, but it's read into the right ear of the child as soon as they're born. And the adhan is, predominantly it's about, the acknowledgement of the oneness of God and Muhammad as the messenger of God. Acknowledging Allah as the one God, Muhammad as the messenger of God. So it's in a way the idea of this is that is the first thing the child hears when they're born. And in a way they open their eyes and they start their prayer by hearing this. That's that's the idea. The other one is what they call the technique, which is something that's also encouraged, where something like dates is kind of crushed, soft, and that's kind of put on top of a pallet. This is something that Prophet Peace be upon him did as well. And it's quite an interesting practice, and it seemed to, I actually started researching the significance of it and scientific aspect of it, and apparently it can really help with the blood sugar levels of the child when they're first born. So there seems to be, especially if they are premature, it seems to be a very important practice. But that is also something that is encouraged. And while doing that, to supplicate, make dua for the child. So dua or supplication is a very important part, or praying for someone is a very important part of Islam. And so doing that when a child is first born is very significant. Naming the child as well is something that's often done on day 3 or 7, potentially. And there's also a lot of importance to the meaning of the name. So as long as it has a good meaning, there's clear instructions on making sure that the name has a good meaning. Another practice is the Aqiqah, which is on the 7th day of the child being born. It is basically, being thankful that the child has been born, and to slaughter a sheep or an animal. I guess these days, in a way, I guess the significance of that is it's a celebration. So you're feeding the community. So you'll find that with a lot of these rituals, they've got a strong communal aspect to it. It's an announcement, it's a celebration, but also that way, continuing to maintain those ties with those around you, your family, your friends, your neighbours, and so forth. So that, in a way, I guess that sacrificing of the lamb is symbolic of, feeding those that are around you. And we know that food is a very strong means of bonding people. Another practice that's done is the shaving of the baby's head, the hair. And this is done on the 7th day, generally speaking. And when the baby's hair is shaved, it's weighed. This is a very specific practice. It's weighed, and depending on the weight of their hair, charity is given. The weight of that in silver is given. So if you've got a child with a lot of hair, you can, get out of but if there's a few strands, you're not going to be losing too much. But that is a practice that's also done. And with that, charity and giving to others is also become an important part of it. And circumcision also for the male child is something that's done early on. On the 7th day is recommended, but in some cultures it's done a bit later. But that's an important practice in Islam for boys as well. So they're the main ones that I've got. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, everyone. I just want to acknowledge as I stand here being a little bit nervous. I'm not sure what I'm more nervous of. It might be Naomi's bell. It might be my esteemed colleagues here who are speaking with me. But I think also there's some of the other people in my own church. You're not really making me nervous, but I want to acknowledge as we gather that I stand here with a particular perspective of Christianity. I think it's really important to say. Everything that I say tonight, there are 2 or 3 other views that will be slightly different or really different. So I just want to own that I stand here as a Pākehā Anglican male priest with I said relatively liberal to Yvette's here, and he said relatively, and he started teasing me. But anyway, so that's who I am and where I come from. I'll try and honour some of the broadness of the Christian view on some of these things, but just important to acknowledge them. I'm also not going to dive straight into answering the actual question. I'm going to mix this next question up a little bit. So I want to also start off with just explaining a concept that I think is important throughout the answer of all the questions we're going to have today, which is just to explain something called sacrament. which is the word that we use probably in answer to most of these questions. So a sacrament in the church is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. So in basic, it's where we do things to symbolise something that we perhaps can't see, a spiritual belief or truth that we have. And so we mark all of these passages through life in a sacramental way. And it's the primary role of the clergy in the Anglican Church. We are ministers of the sacrament. Many would assume that I'd probably talk here about baptism. It's probably a word many people have heard. I'm not going to talk about baptism here. I'm going to answer it in the next question, which is about coming of age, and I hope that makes sense when we get to it. There are some other traditions that we do have, though, around the birth of a child. Particularly, I think an older tradition, if you look back into the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, the English prayer book of several hundred years ago, there was a service called the Thanksgiving of Women after childbirth, also known as the Churching of Women, which probably came from a lot of different places, but a part of that was really celebrating the survival of the mother in a time really where the mortality in childbirth was really high. Over time, that and the changing of the views around women and returning to church and issues of purity perhaps meant that we've really shifted that to being the Thanksgiving for the gift of a child, which is an opportunity to celebrate, to pray for and give thanks for the arrival of a child, as well as for the parents and to celebrate this expanded family. I think also of in Luke's Gospel, in our scriptures, chapter 2, where Mary and Joseph brought Jesus to the temple and saw Simeon and Anna there, and they blessed the child. So they were bringing Jesus, of course, for a Jewish Thanksgiving, all right. And in that, though, we continue to want to celebrate and dedicate children. So if not baptism, that we certainly dedicate children in our church, which is an opportunity to welcome them into the family of the church and to dedicate them to God and to welcome them onto the journey, not just of life, but the journey of faith. There you go, big first bell in 19 seconds.
Good evening, and let me welcome you all here to Beth Shalom. It's really a pleasure to see our hall filled with so many friends, and I'm glad we could spend this evening together. And that we can spend it talking about rites of passage, these milestone, important moments in a human life. As we mark those occasions, we are celebrating life in its totality. We celebrate the human experience of birth and maturation and fading into death, all of which describe what it means to be a human being. Some of the occasions that we will discuss tonight are not optional. They happen to all of us, and some happen to some but not to others. And so with that said, let's begin with birth, this thing that happens to all of us, or we would not be human beings living here. And it's an opportunity, of course, to celebrate that a child has come into the world, and to mark the occasion not only for the baby, who's probably not very aware of what's going on, but perhaps even more importantly, for their family and their community, to understand that life has profoundly changed and will never go back again. The primary ritual for the birth of a child in the Jewish tradition is Brit Milah, or the joining of the covenant of Israel through circumcision. The ritual itself derives from Abraham in the book of Genesis, and he was to circumcise not only himself, but all his household and all dependents afterwards. And we circumcise on the 8th day, which is, I understand, just after the human body is able to make scabs. So it's really the soonest time that a child can be circumcised as safely as possible. It's worth noting that while circumcision is required for all boys, it's not required for boys who are the brothers of a hemophiliac. If there's an older sibling who's a hemophiliac, a younger sibling has a 1 in 4 chance of being a hemophiliac and therefore not being able to make a scab, and so that child is exempt, which is to say that as profound as the mitzvah is, as foundational as it is that we circumcise our boys, we would never risk the life of a child, that life comes before even those fundamental religious obligations. At Brit Milah, the child is given his name, and he is seated on what we call Kiseh Eliyahu, the chair of Elijah. Elijah being the prophet who heralds the coming of the perfect age. So by seating the child on that throne, we are saying that this child may play a role in the bringing of the messianic time, the bringing of perfection. And that's a pretty important message to give to a child and to his parents as well, that this baby is so precious, the world is relying on him and relying on them. I should say that as progressive Jews here at Beth Shalom and all around the world, we treat boys and girls, males and females equally in all regards. So while there is not Brit Milah, not circumcision for girls, we absolutely do welcome girls, typically on the 8th day. And in recent times, that's been done with the washing of the feet, which is part of that same story of Abraham and his circumcision. He received the guests who may have been angels and washed their feet. Sometimes these ceremonies are done here at synagogue, and there's a blessing to the Torah as well. In addition, some parents will plant a tree on the occasion of a child's birth, and I'll tell you why in 2 rounds. Yes, I think I'm done now. Thank you.
Well, I even learned something about my own religion. As well as the other religions. Okay, so the second question is, how do you mark the coming of age of a child? And we're asking Michael to start with.
My turn to go first. I've already sort of warmed this question up a little bit under the last question. One of the 2 key sacraments of the church, in particularly in Anglicanism, the 2 key ones are baptism and the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, which are the 2 that Jesus initiated and that took part in. And so one of those is baptism, and that's really when it comes to coming of age or welcoming into and the initiation into the church is really what that's about. Jesus was baptized by John at the beginning of his ministry. And at the Great Commission, at the end of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus sends the disciples out with the command, go and baptize. So go out and grow the church, spread your faith. So baptism in its very essence is to make people a member of the body of Christ, so to make them a part of the church. So that's the initiation in which we gather people into the church. In the earliest days, if we look at the book of Acts, so in the very early church, the whole households were baptised and as a part of that children. And so particularly for the mainstream church, but certainly within Anglicanism, we baptise children, we welcome them into the church and baptise them as infants. And so in many ways that's the answer to the question about what we do around birth, because that is for many, particularly Anglicans, the key sacrament or key rite at that time. But there are some Christian traditions who don't do that. For them, it is about to be baptised and to become a member of the body of the church. You need to be able to make a personal commitment, and so you can't do that as a child. And so that's where they will dedicate them as a baby, and then let them journey a little until they get to an age where they're willing to be able to engage and make that decision for themselves. Within the Anglican tradition, we take the view that we baptise someone as a baby. And then they come of age as they grow up. They're part of the family from the very beginning, and they grow up in faith. And so in that side of things, we then have something called confirmation. And so confirmation is that opportunity as a teenager, as a young adult, to be able to publicly state and publicly make statements of faith. And so they're sort of some of the rites of passage, as it were, the coming of age. So you tend to have either baptised as a child and then you make your confirmation as an adult, or you might be dedicated as a child and work your way through to wanting to be baptised. So I hope that makes some sense. The only other rite of passage which I'd probably mention here, not so much within the Anglican Church, but is the admission to communion. Within the Anglican Church, you can take part in communion, the sharing of bread and wine at church, right from the beginning. It hasn't always been that way, and in other parts of church where communion is shared, you have to be able to sort of, I guess, engage in an understanding of what that means before you can, and so there'll be some ceremony, some rite around being able to do that, and a little bit more of a celebration here, but that also is quite a key sacrament.
Well, we human beings, of course, are mammals. And thank goodness. Because that means we change as we grow, but we don't change nearly as much as amphibians or insects. But perhaps it is in our teenage years that we experience our most profound transformation. Those of us who are parents of teenagers will know what a huge shift it is from a 9-year-old who's cuddly and loving and does exactly what they're told to a 14-year-old who would much rather close the door to their room, and as smelly as it is, that's just fine. So as the child changes, their place in our community changes. And we mark that as Jews through the ceremony of bar or bat mitzvah, which is to say that we tell a child that you can assume a place of responsibility, of adult privilege within the community, but you have to earn it. It's not just given to you. And so we ask our kids to study. We ask them to study so that they can lead a service here, surrounded by community, some of whom they know very well and some of whom they only see from time to time. So they have to learn the prayers and get up in front of people and read them and sing them. We take the Torah scroll, which is behind that blue curtain, out of the ark and lay it in front of them. It is handwritten in Hebrew, and the child is expected to read from it. And not just to read from it, but to interpret it, to share with all of us their thoughts about the passage they've just read. In order to do that, they've needed to study, typically with the rabbi, and they get a sense of their burgeoning intellect. And they look out at a congregation sort of like this, of a room full of adults who are paying attention to them and listening and nodding and saying, young person, what you have to say matters. Who you are in the world and your perspective matters to us. And I'll tell you, that is just magic for a kid who's used to just being ordered around or ignored. Suddenly they know that they can hold space and that their perspective counts and that their ideas are worth something. But they also know that they have to work for it. They've spent perhaps a year studying a little bit every day and regularly with me and with the tutor so that they are capable. And so they've learned that they can achieve hard things, but they have to work for it. They've learned that there are adults in the world who are there to help them. They've learned that they need to ask for help when they need it, but when they ask for help, they will get it. And that affects the transformation of the young person into the adult they're becoming. And at the same time, it affects the congregation and the parents, importantly, to say, this is not my child anymore. This is my young adult. And I have to treat them as such so that they will treat me with respect in return. And I'll tell you, being the rabbi for bar and bat mitzvah is one of the greatest elements of my work, because seeing these children mature into young adults and claim the reins of their lives is just extraordinary, and I'm very grateful to get to be a witness and a part of it. Thank you.
In Islam, there's really not a ritual or the concept of coming of age, but age is important, and in a way, I guess, I was saying Islamic psychology, a child's, I guess their growth is separated into three, from 0 to 7, 7 to 14, and then 14 and up. And basically, it's about plus or minus with the 14, but when they have seen, I guess when they reach puberty, when they reach maturation, then they have responsibilities of the religion upon them. But if we take a step back, it doesn't just happen overnight. It's not like, oh yeah, you're 14 now, boom, here you go do all this. Oh, boom, this is what it's all about. But it's really about, so from 0 to 7, Islam encourages Muslims to play and engage with children, and to have that initial connection, compassion, that playfulness is very important for their growth, for their psychology and so forth. And we see many examples during the Prophet's time where, with his grandchildren, he would, because if you've seen Muslims pray, it's, there's the standing, there's bowing, prostrating, and when a child sees you doing things like that, they just want to jump on you. And so there is examples of where he would let them flow with that. The kids would flow with him. So if he's bowing down and they're holding on. If you've seen any Insta videos, or if you haven't, they're just amazing. The kids, how acrobatic they can get. They hold on to the shoulders, and then when the parent gets up, they're dangling from the shoulders. But this was okay. This was considered to be okay, and he actually encouraged it because he did it himself. Side note, there's really nice cat ones as well. I've got 3 cats. I know this isn't about cats. Okay, we need to do one about cats, and you see the on the person. But hey, let's get back to the kids. Focus, Lane, focus. There's that immersion, I guess, and even within the mosque, kids are encouraged to come. And there's an example where the Prophet was praying, and he hears a child in that circumstance where it's crying, and he says, I really wanted to prolong the prayer, but because I heard the child crying, I didn't want the mother to get distressed, so I shortened the prayer. So he was willing to be lenient, so that I guess children can be part of that environment and then growing that. So 7 to 14, therefore, a big part of that is about educating, in further immersion, I guess, learning the rituals, the practices, understanding the purpose and the wisdom behind those practices, and starting them. And then, as I said, with the at the age of about 14, that's when the responsibility is upon them to say, okay, these are the roles and responsibilities that I have as a Muslim, and I will take them on.
So the next question is, what marks a wedding in your faith? I know we talked about children, and we're going to put that to front, but on to weddings.
Weddings are joyous occasions in Jewish communities, as they are in communities all around the world, communities of all stripes. And there are set elements of the Jewish wedding ritual that are required by law. And there are some other elements of the Jewish wedding ritual that are folk traditions and that are optional, that are customary but not always engaged in. So, for example, before the couple gets married on the wedding day, it is customary, it is traditional to start with what's called the bedeck, where the bride and groom gather together, typically with their family, and the bride's veil is lifted so that the groom can look at her and say, yes, that's the woman I meant to marry. You may remember the story of Jacob, who married Leah instead of Rachel. And we say that that's the antecedent for checking before the wedding happens. When I officiate at Bedeckins, though, rather than having the groom look at the bride, I ask the couple to look at one another and to confirm in this private moment that that is indeed their beloved and the person that they wish to marry. At that same ceremony, they sign a ketubah, a Jewish wedding agreement, a contract, and that is witnessed as well. And then we begin the wedding, the public wedding ceremony, which, as I say, has many different steps, some of which are prescribed and some of which are optional. Every Jewish wedding takes place in the same place, which is to say it takes place under the chuppah, the wedding canopy, which is symbolic of the Jewish home, and which is open on all four sides, just like the tent of Abraham and Sarah, open to guests and to joy and to adventure, whatever goodness that life can bring to the couple. Some couples begin with the bride circling the groom 7 times. Many contemporary couples circle each other 7 times, 7 being the number of perfection, and it's a ritual that binds the two together. During that wedding ceremony, we make kiddush, we bless and drink wine twice, which is really unusual for a Jewish ceremony. Typically, you would drink wine just once. That is the evidence that today's Jewish wedding actually used to be 2 separate ceremonies. It used to be the betrothal for the first glass of wine and the wedding for the second, which over time have fused into one. And there's a bit of archaeology, ritual archaeology available when you see that. The couple is married through the exchange of a ring. That is what affects the marriage and the signing of the ketubah rather than the statement of vows. In fact, the Jewish wedding doesn't have vows, but it does have a statement. Harei at mikudeshet li b'taba'at zo. Behold, you are sanctified to me. You are set apart from all other people that I will ever meet through the rest of my life. My relationship with you is different from all those other people, and this ring is the sign of that. The ceremony reaches its conclusion with the singing of the Sheva Brachot, the 7 wedding blessings, and very typically the breaking of the glass, which concludes the ceremony, which is a remembrance of the destruction of the temple and the fragility of love, that even in this moment when love is just overflowing, we still need to treat it as if it were fragile, because in fact it is, and it can break. I want to just say that in contemporary Jewish circles, including here at Beth Shalom, the marriages that we see are among from equal to equal, and we certainly officiate at weddings of 2 men or 2 women, 2 people who choose to be together. We accept that as kiddushin, sanctified and holy. I'll also just point out that Jews have divorce and certainly allow that through a ceremony called the get. Thank you.
Okay, marriage. So, to be honest, I was thinking about Islamic marriages, and although I think there's a lot of culture that's involved in it, so I'll tell you what is required Islamically, but it is so coloured by the different cultures, and that's why which it seems is across the traditions. And you really need to hone in and find out what is actually Islamically required and what is not, because sometimes we think culture can be obligatory because my, siblings did it, my cousins did it, so I have to do it. But then the main thing I would say is you need basically two willing parties, the willing parties basically. So both the male and the female has to be willing to be married. They can't be forced into a marriage. And that's why one of the things that Imam would say is, would ask the girl, are you willing to marry so-and-so? And she would have to say yes. And he would then also have to say yes, and they normally do that 3 times. You need witnesses, so you would have 2 witnesses who witness that marriage, basically. And so through that, once they say yes, the Imam would give them a bit of a talk, give them advice, be newlywed, and then would officially declare them married, and the witnesses will also, I guess, bear witness to this union. Probably one key part of a wedding is the dowry, or meher. The Islamic term that's used is meher. It's loosely translated dowry, but dowry's probably got other connotations as well. So a female is asked what she wants as her meher, and she basically can say what she wants it to be, and it's really up to her, and it varies significantly. The idea of the meher is that, you know, if the marriage doesn't, we'll talk about divorce next, but if the marriage doesn't go too well, it becomes her financial, I guess, it's her better way to look after herself financially. And it doesn't just have to be with divorce, but even if she wants, you know, she can claim to have a certain amount of financial wealth. Sometimes they might say, oh, just, you know, if he takes me to pay for my Hajj pilgrimage trip. Other times it could be money, other times it could be an asset, but she has the liberty to ask for that kind of financial, let's call it security, and that becomes hers. And he needs to accept it, you know, and be willing to give that for that marriage to be taken, to be approved. Sometimes I think in today's society we think, is that really significant? But I think it's particularly important in societies where women may not have that financial independence like we do in first world countries. Not all countries have, you know, single parent pensions. I'm not sure if New Zealand does actually. Does it? Yeah. So, you know, in countries, in first world countries, you have social welfare, but in some other countries you don't. So if you're in a divorce situation, that could be that money could save you from very difficult circumstances, basically. And that's why, and we also know that a lot of women don't want to leave marriages if they're not financially independent or if they can't financially look after themselves, and therefore they can tolerate the views that they should not be. So that marriage is very, very important, and it has to be part of that marriage contract. So that's marriage in a nutshell.
Yeah, I want to agree with the sentiment that, you know, it's a little hard to untangle what might be sort of our religious approach to marriage and often some of the cultural practices. I mean, even for Christians in different countries, you know, a wedding in New Zealand compared to England, compared to Croatia probably looks quite different. You know, what people wear and a lot of some practices will do with a lot of local custom, but there are some similarities at home. Look, yes, weddings are obviously a moment of huge celebration. Not just for a couple, but it's important that it's within a community. It's a community recognising with a new relationship as well. Jesus shared in going to weddings, and one particularly famous one is one of my favourite paintings. If you go to Paris and go to the Louvre and go and see the Mona Lisa, that smirk on her face is because she's enjoying my favourite painting as well. It's on the opposite wall. It's called The Wedding at Cana, and it's you know, this whole wall. It's a great painting, and it's full of festivity and excitement and joy, and that's of course what weddings are. Weddings are obviously an opportunity for a couple to dedicate themselves to one another and make commitments to one another about the life ahead of them. But it's also an opportunity for couples to invite, within a faithful perspective, to invite the Holy Spirit, to invite God to be in the midst of their relationship as well. I guess to commit themselves to a shared journey of faith as much as a shared journey of life. Look, what service, you know, the sort of the prayer service of marriage has some sort of key components. There are the declarations, which is where the couple being married need to declare their willingness and their free willingness to be married. So, you know, you can only get married if that's what the two people want. We listen to scripture and often around the themes of marriage, and we exchange vows. So I'm sure you've watched enough movies to know that I take you to Heaven to Hold for This Day Forth, Better for Worse for Richard Pora, etc. And so, there, I'd say wedding couples, in civil spaces now, you often hear in this space couples who are they're sharing this lovely story about why they love each other so much, and they often will write their own vows and they'll be different. I don't like either of those things. Vows for me are about the future. It's a covenant, it's a promise to the other person about this is the life that we will lead together. And again, for that reason, I'm a big fan of saying, look, write your vows if you must together, but please write your vows that are the same, because that's what a contract is. You're agreeing together on what marriage will look like. I might be a little bit on my own on that. But there are vows within the group which people tend to use it. The ones I read off with obviously the particularly well-known ones. They're ones that Rebecca and I used at our wedding as well. We have from a sacramental perspective, the exchange of the wedding ring is the same. It's the symbol of eternity. It's a circle. It's made of precious materials often, and so that says something about the value in which you hold your relationship, and so the exchange of them, which have been blessed, is about saying something about that marriage. It's that symbolic of that spiritual grace and truth that you share together. Prayers, so we'll pray for a couple, pray for them both in the current space as they go to lead their life, and also pray for us as a community that we will uphold the couple and the relationship that they share. And then we finish. Go on. Come on. And then the service then finishes with a blessing. So that's the priest offering the blessing for this couple as they go on that journey together.
So some of you have already talked a little bit about our next question, which is, what is your faith's response to divorce? So it's not quite a life cycle event, and that we hope that not many people have to go through divorce, but it is very much a reality of life. So we're starting with Suzanne.
I guess with divorce, Islamically it is considered to be permissible. It's described as something that's least liked by God, but something that is permissible. So I guess in a way, the way that's put is, once you get married, you try to make it lifelong. You try to make it work. And your first thing isn't to opt out. And in the Quran, it talks about how there should be mediation between the people, the couple, with the families, and try to resolve these difficulties. But if that's not possible, that the two parties should separate in an amicable way, is the description. So I want to highlight that culturally, this is, with a lot of these practices, I guess, culture can sometimes be separate from what the religion says, and probably divorce is one of those things where the right to divorce, especially for women, may not be as accessible as it should be Islamically because of cultural influence. But when you look at it Islamically, it is, and there's many examples from the life. We refer to the life of Prophet Muhammad quite a bit because his I guess what he says is, after the Quran, what he says is the most important thing to us. And there's an incident, so I'll explain that to you, where a woman comes to him and says, my father married me to a person and I did not want to be in that marriage. And he says, if that's the case, then the marriage is annulled. And then she says, actually, I'm happy to stay in the marriage, but I just wanted to make this point. And it's a very important point that sets a precedence for us even today. It goes back to the thing I mentioned about the marriage, where both parties have to be willing, but if they're not willing, then it's not a marriage, and no one can be forced into a marriage. But also there are other examples where divorce did take place during the Prophet's time and was absolutely okay. Actually, when you look at I feel like, sort of reflecting on the Muslim community today, probably in some cultures it's more challenging than others, but I honestly feel 1400 years ago they were more comfortable with divorce than we are today in certain cultures, which amazes me. The Prophet, he was married to a divorcee. His two daughters got divorced and they remarried. And these were absolutely fine for this to happen. It seemed like a normal part of life, it happens kind of thing where, yes, you can get divorced, it's okay, and that's fine, it's okay, you can remarry. There was no, I guess, taboo associated with marrying a divorcee. This is probably like self-reflecting, this is something we can do much better in the community, I believe. So, thank you.
I think we've got this sorted out there. We're doing okay. Yeah, look, divorce in the church probably had a bit of a difficult history around divorce, and there would be a number of divergent views on this subject in particular. The old Book of Common Prayer Service, again, it had this lovely phrase, those who God has joined together, let no one put asunder. That was the phrase that you'd make as the couple were being married. So I guess in part there's this idea that, when a couple are married, it's God that's bringing them together in this sort of sacred relationship, and so sort of how dare we allow for a way in which, if God put it together, we couldn't possibly take it apart. Scriptures have some particularly, forceful statements around divorce and marriage, and I think that's part of the challenge. Particularly, I think St. Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, had some things to say around divorce. But I think we need to understand that Paul was responding as he travelled around sort of the known world at that time. He was responding to some particular contextual issues that he faced, and meeting communities very different from his own, who had some, he sort of saw sexual immorality and was responding to that in a way. So I think was trying to respond to this idea that we need to maintain the sanctity and the sacred nature of marriage. And so, couples should just likely just part ways. I'm not sure if that was, this is my own sort of views here, that doesn't mean that in some circumstances that would be appropriate. I think, I'll just name this here, the view of wider society would probably sit there and go, hey, wait a second, you're Anglican. Wasn't your church founded on the basis of divorce? How many hundreds of years ago with King Henry VIII? You guys were all Catholic, and the king wanted to get divorced, and the Pope wouldn't let him, so you made up your own church. That's not really, that's an unfortunate view, and legacy that we have as a church. I just want to say, I think the King Henry VIII was really rebelling against an external authority, telling him what he can and can't do as the king of his own country. Just happened to be that divorce was the issue. But I think the point stands that there's been some difficulty around this. But actually, the reality is for a long time, divorce has been possible. And it's not actually divorce that's the issue for the church, I think. More recently, it's actually been the remarriage of those who are divorced that's become, I think, been more problematic. And so if you were divorced, you could get married again, but not in the church. And until 1970, in this country, that was the rule. If you were a divorcee, you couldn't get married in the church. And in the United Kingdom, the Church of England, it was this millennium, it was 2002, I think, where that rule changed. Look, the landscape now is very different from what it had been. I think we've engaged with our faith and our traditions a bit more. Certainly now there's no issues. If you are legally allowed to get married, then you are legally allowed to get married, and you're willing to do so in the church. Acknowledging some issues around sexuality and same-sex marriage, which I think I'll just say the church is still working through. And so I think that's, as I stepped down last time, I realised I've missed a whole section of my notes. I don't think, but anyway, look, I think that's a reasonable thing. So look, I think I agree with the comment about, we never want to enter into divorce, but there will always be space for that need to happen. I think that it's important that a couple are happy and being in a positive relationship together, and I think that's got to be the most important thing. So.
As I see it, divorce absolutely is a life cycle event. It is a rite of passage. Just like marriage, which not everyone enters into, so too with divorce that not everyone enters into. And yet, through the rituals of divorce, we are transformed. Our internal identity, the way we understand ourselves, has changed, and our family and our community sees us in a different way now as a single person again. As Jews, there are at least two approaches to divorce. Traditional Jews, first of all, I should say that I will repeat that divorce is accepted throughout Judaism as it has been since time immemorial. But traditional Jews look to the synagogue and the rabbi more profoundly as the initiator of the holiness of that ceremony. And so it is to the rabbi that that couple goes for divorce. Progressive Jews are more likely to see themselves as married through the authority of the state, and therefore it is their civil divorce that is more important to them. That said, as a progressive rabbi, couples absolutely do come to me seeking a religious divorce, a spiritual divorce, that, as I said before, is called a get. And there is a specific ceremony for that. Just as they signed a ketubah, a marriage contract that signaled that they were married, so too do they sign a bill of divorce, and the corner is cut, indicating that that document has been executed, that it is now in effect. So that means that the couple has to come and sit in my presence and in one another's presence, and that's not always easy to arrange, especially if there's a lot of acrimony. In addition to signing that document, we do the reverse of what happened at the wedding. I mentioned the drinking of wine. The couple, both parties drink from the same cup as a sign that they share life's adventure now. But at the get ceremony, we take a single cup of water, not the wine that brings about joy, but something as plain and basic as water, in one cup, and I pour it into 2 cups from which they both drink, signaling the parting of their paths. And then they leave the space through different doors. They take different paths out, marking it from that occasion onward. Their lives are taking different directions, and that they are on their own unique journey now. I want to go back to the cliffhanger I set up when I spoke about a child being born, and that some couples plant a tree at that point. I mentioned also that the wedding ceremony takes place in the chuppah, under the wedding canopy. Well, that is held on 4 sticks or poles. So what some families do when they plant that tree at the birth of a child is that they harvest it when the child is engaged, and they use those poles to hold the chuppah at the wedding ceremony. So it's a beautiful connection of the moments of it.
So now we're moving into death and mourning. What are your customs relating to death and mourning? And we're starting with
Obviously a really significant part of the life cycle, and I think we'll get a little bit of that in the next question, which will be about afterlife, I guess a life cycle into a new life. Obviously the most common custom related to death and mourning is the funeral service, which is a gathering of the community, your family, your friends, others in the community who wish to gather to mourn together and to celebrate together. I haven't just written too many books, but this is the way that I explain to families when I'm sitting down with them, that The funeral service really has two sections to it. We begin by celebrating a person's life, and that will be where we tell stories about them, where we say things that were important to them. We celebrate really who they were and what they offered to their family and friends, and what we'll remember, and that part of their life that might continue to live through the way we express our lives. And then the second part is to commend and commit a person to God, and so that's sort of done through our prayers, in particular prayers of committal and commendation, reading scriptures and reflecting on them. I think at funeral services there's often two quite conflicting emotions. We're human, and we've spent a long time with the person that, hopefully, in other ways. So, but for various reasons, we're sad because they're no longer with us. We don't get to continue walking life's journey with them. So, of course, we gather and we mourn. We're upset, and we're mourning the loss of someone that's been, a person that's been important to us. But that's balanced too with what our funeral service tells us, which is also that there's also reason to rejoice and to celebrate. This person is with God. This person is now enjoying something which is beyond what we can see. And we can often feel that tension, particularly for someone who has been a person of deep faith, who we're wanting to say, look, we're sad that you're no longer with us, but let's celebrate because this is something that in part, in sort of a way, that they'll be looking forward to. So they're with God in a more full sense now. Before that, leading up to death, it depends, I guess, how that happens, but there are other things that we offer by way of helping someone prepare for their death. And we do have a formal service in our prayer book called Imaginatively Prayers at the Time of Death. We need to come up with some new names. And that can include all sorts of things. It will include prayers, where we might anoint a person, which we do when someone is unwell. It's prayers anointing with holy oil to bring wholeness to the person, but it's a particular time as they are facing death to bring them wholeness in that sense. An opportunity for confession in particular that's important to a person. They might receive communion if they're able to, if that's important to them, and of course offering pastoral care, talking with the person and helping them to get their head around what is happening to them, what they fear, because we all face fears at that time of the day. So those things aren't necessarily about, I don't think are about making things right with God before you die. I think it will be for some people, but I think it really is about helping somebody to be ready for the journey as much as we can. So I think as community we often will just be meeting people where they are to help them face what is ahead of them.
I love being Jewish. And I love being Jewish perhaps never more than when I am encountering death. And that is because Judaism provides what I have found to be an extraordinary set of understandings and practices around end of life. It gives us a structure to know what to do and what to expect when it feels that we have fallen off a cliff. And the practices that Judaism encourages are psychologically sound. They support us and do not ask us to feel or do anything that is at odds with our own human nature. Judaism divides time into 4 periods, beginning at the moment of death. Between death and the burial is a liminal time, a time that's betwixt and between. Those of us who've had a loved one die know how awkward that is. They are not here, but they're not gone yet. And part of you feels normal and fills out the paperwork like you have to do, and part of you wants to pull over the covers or more and never get out of it. And so because of that, we pause, but we bury as promptly as possible. Because it helps a person to move into the next phase, out of the liminal phase. Between death and burial, the body is prepared through the ceremony of Tahora, which is the ritual washing, purification of the body, and the dressing in linen garments, and the placement into the casket. The funeral itself is a generally simple affair. The body is present in the casket, always a closed casket, and always a plain, simple casket. It is not Jewish practice to have a fancy or elaborate one. We are all equal in death, and we all have a similar or even identical casket, no matter who we were in life. The casket is closed because we are not trying to pretend that this person is still alive. We are not trying to say that didn't happen. In fact, the work of the funeral for those of us who survive is to say goodbye, which is to say to acknowledge this profound and irrevocable change. We lay the person to rest with the recitation of prayer and psalms, two standard ones, most importantly, most famously, Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's prayer. And then we enter into the second period of time, which is Shiva, the 7 days of mourning, where friends and family, the community come over and are with us and look through pictures and tell stories, or sometimes just sit silently. Unlike what you described, for Jews, there is no celebration of life. The time of death is full of lots of emotions, but for us, it is not a time to celebrate. It's a time to feel all of our feelings, no matter what they may be. We remember, and we may laugh, and we may honor them indeed, but we don't celebrate. Because that just doesn't feel right. After the 7 days of mourning, we enter into a 30-day period and then a year period. During each of these, the mourning rituals are lessened, and the circle of folks who are to engage in those behaviors, like not working, are lessened. This time I'm going to take all 5. Are lessened as we gradually return to life and to the activity of life. And that's powerful because it gives us a time to pull back, to catch up to the spiritual whiplash of what has just happened, but it also requires us to emerge back into the world, to go back into grocery shopping and life and all of those things, including coming to synagogue regularly. The principal mourners are expected for that first year to recite that mourner's prayer, Kaddish Yatom, every single day in the presence of 10 adult Jews, which means that you must get out of bed and get dressed and get to synagogue and engage with other people. You must re-emerge into the land of the living.
I guess when I think about deaths, particularly in the morning, the word that comes to my mind is closure. And especially my friend Magda, who's very highly, she's studying social work, and she's looking at different theories about closure and how important it is, and how within Islam, there's within so many different phases of life, there is a sense of closure. Even if you're partying, if you're traveling somewhere, there's certain prayers you would say. If you're departing from a friend, there are certain prayers you're saying. And I guess when someone passes away, closure is so important. And to be honest, for me, this was really highlighted. The importance of closure it's very personal. When my father passed away less than 2 years ago, and I realised how important closure was. One reason was he passed away overseas. It was COVID era, and obviously I didn't get to see him. But you work out your own ways of doing that closure, even when you're not in the same city with them, and which might be like, Mum, can you please video record his burial? Could you please record what, just so I can see it, so I know it's real. So I think the rituals with all the faiths around burial is so important. There's a huge psychological importance to it. So with Muslims, when a person passes away, there is a ritual bath that's given. I guess it's the last wash, cleansing the body. They're hoping to create a sense of purity. The body is shrouded with white shrouds, and again, everyone being shrouded with the same cloth. There's this equaling effect that has within the, at least in this world domain. And once that is done, there is preparations for the funeral. The Imam leads the funeral prayer. The funeral prayer is quite short, and it's quite different to the other 5 daily prayers, but it is something that's done in congregation. An important part of the funeral prayer is that it's considered to be, it's called Fard Kifaya, which means that it is compulsory, that it is undertaken for that person. So there are certain things that every individual has that responsibility of, but there is certain other responsibilities where if a certain number of members of the community do it, the obligation is off the whole community. Let's say someone passed away and no one did their funeral prayer, that whole community is responsible for that, they're accountable for that. So they have to fulfill that responsibility towards that member of that community, even though they've passed away. So that funeral prayer is very important. It is, undertaken, and then usually at the mosque, and after that taken to the cemetery for the burial. There is no coffin with Muslims. They don't actually use. So basically, the person gets buried with just with the shrouds and lowered down. Usually, family members are there to lower the person that's deceased, and then normally Quran is recited as the sword is put on top of them. And then the mourning process. Obviously, mourning starts before that, but the mourning process continues. And this is a time when the family needs to be supported. And there's a lot of effort made to make sure that there's minimal things the family need to do. So everyone will come around to try to support them, to provide help in whatever way they can, bring food, and so forth. So that kind of emotional support is also important. And I would say for me, I've also talking about whether it's celebration or we try to console the person, I guess, as best as possible, the family. And I always try to say to family members, think of this as a temporary separation. And I find that really helps family members. And this is probably going to go links well to the talk about afterlife. Death is not seen as a severing, but it's seen as a temporary separation. And I think that provides a lot of reassurance to family members who've lost family members, and thus the importance of belief in the afterlife.
So that leads in to our last question. Does your faith believe in an afterlife? And Rabbi Dean, yeah.
What a challenging question. For all human beings who have ever lived, right? This is one of the great questions that has perplexed us and engaged us and enticed us. And it's hard to answer that question from a Jewish perspective with some 3,000 years of recorded history and living in cultures all around the world. There is certainly not just one Jewish perspective. So I will do as best I can to give a whirlwind tour. And to do that, of course, I have to start with the Torah, with the 5 books of Moses, which talks about death in 2 principal ways. When some characters in the Torah die, it is said he died and was gathered to his fathers, which for a long time was understood as a reunification with the members of the family. Although it's also true that recent archaeological finds in the Holy Land show the use of ossuaries, that that bodies were laid out until they were turned to bones, and then the bones were gathered and put with the bones of their ancestors. So perhaps the Bible there was being literal and not metaphoric. But the Bible also says he died and went to Sheol. And many people have speculated, what is this Sheol? Is it heaven? Is it hell? Is it some other thing? Except people who know Hebrew. People who know Hebrew know that the root of the word Sheol is the same as the word She'elah, question. So we can understand Sheol to be the great unknown, which is to say that while Jews have, through the millennia, believed with great fervency in different perspectives on what happens after we die, I think that we also have a healthy skepticism, which is to say that we recognize this is one of the great mysteries. So what have Jews believed? In particular, during the rabbinic period, we could call that 200 before the Common Era to 200 or so after the Common Era, when the temple was destroyed and life in the Holy Land was very difficult. We absolutely do see in Jewish literature a description of a life after death as a reward for good deeds here on earth. That is clear in the Talmud and the Midrash. Later on, the Kabbalists, the great Jewish mystics, primarily but not exclusively of Europe, who are from about the 13th to the 17th century, many of them believe in Gilgul HaNefesh, the great circle of the soul, which is to say reincarnation. Many contemporary Jews debate what happens after we die. Some, like one great Jewish philosopher, my grandmother, who said, when you're dead, you're dead. That was her philosophy. It ends, and that's just the end of it. And if that is the case, that the body stops and the soul stops, that does not mean that the person stops or that their energy stops, because the love we feel for them continues on. And we re-engage with it through memory. Jews also believe in doing good deeds to keep the memory of the deceased alive. And very often will name a descendant for, in the Ashkenazic tradition, in the European tradition, for a deceased ancestor, which keeps that memory alive. I will tell you, as someone who has been at the bedside of people as they have died repeatedly, that I know that something leaves the body. And the only word that I can use for that is soul. I can't tell you where it goes, but I know that it was there and that it is not. I have seen it and felt it too often. And so I believe that that soul, that life force that animates us and makes us specifically the individual that we are, returns to the source of all, the source of life from which we all spring. So that while our individual existence may not continue, our shared existence absolutely does. Of that I am certain.
I think by now I would work out who's next, but I'm going to ask. Okay, belief in the afterlife is a very strong part of it's actually one of the tenets of faith, belief in the afterlife. And when you look at the Quran, you could say in a way 25% of the Quran talks about the afterlife. And when you, so in a way, while this life is important, this life is seen as being a part of the journey, and that eternity or the life after death is the eternal life. So in one way, we see this life as Muslims as being where you do the good that you can, and you plant the seeds and you reap the rewards in the afterlife. And there's a saying of Muhammad where it says, I guess my life in this world is like sitting under a tree, under the shade of a tree before moving on. So in a way, he's highlighting, I would say, that the shortness of this life, even if it's 60 or 80 or 100 years, compared to eternity, it is short. A lot of emphasis is given to the afterlife, and I just remembered when someone passes away, actually it's a phrase that's used in other occasions too, it's inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. From him we come and to him we return. So there is this sense of returning back to the source as well, and in Islam. And there's quite a bit of detail through the narratives of the prophet about what happens in the afterlife. I won't go into it, but there is this sense that there is going to be a resurrection, and we are going to be, accountable for our deeds, depending on our circumstances as well. Everyone's based on their circumstances. They will be evaluated based on the opportunities that they had, I guess. That God, through His grace and mercy, will evaluate that person, and respond to that person accordingly. So I would say that, for many Muslims, that brings a lot of consolation in the sense if they're seeing injustice in this world, they know that absolute justice will prevail in the afterlife. If they're seeing cruelty, oppression, tyranny, and so forth, they know that again it will. Those who are being oppressed will, reap the rewards or see true again justice in the afterlife. So it's very much part of the cycle of Muslim, I would say. Living in the present, so it's not like living in the future, living in the present, but also being conscious that there is this eternal existence that awaits them. And again, therefore, when talking about loved ones passing away, seeing that as a temporary separation and hoping to have that reunion in the afterlife.
In John's Gospel, chapter 3, probably one of the most quotable verses out of the New Testament for Christians. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that all those who believe in Him shall not perish but have eternal life. It's sort of one of those all-encompassing sort of trying to catch much stuff, phrases that we're good at remembering, especially somebody who's not very good at remembering anything. The key thing there is this promise of eternal life and a relationship between belief and I think expressing and exercising that belief. Those are the things that we actually do in our lives. But it's linked to this idea of and this promise of eternal life. Jesus' own resurrection, it calls us to a resurrected life. And this idea that, and we talk about this at funerals, death is defeated, death has lost its sting. Death is no more the thing that bounds the end of our life because there's something beyond that. And there's something to look forward to beyond. And that is the eternal life. I think just hearing some of the other words spoken from as a chaplain in the Navy, we talk about crossing the bar. Someone doesn't die, they cross the bar. And it's a Navy thing, if you have a sandbank through the middle of a channel, you try to drive a boat over it, you can't, you run aground. So, there's still the ocean over there, it's just that you can't get there. And I think that sense of being separated, again, when a lot of those who pass away, we no longer see, but we will see again. And I think there's that same sense within their call to eternal life. But what that looks like, how that happens, and what you have to do to get there, those will always be the things of great debate. And I challenge any Christian who thinks they know all the answers to all those questions. I don't think anyone really has all of that, because there is a huge variety of opinion, and at the end of the day, none of us have been there. And so, Scripture has various images, and I think it can be confused about in terms of our own death and our own passing, and the eternal life to which we're called, and then there's sort of the end time conversations when we read towards the end of the Scriptures in the book of Revelation that talk about the return of Jesus once more, and so that and sort of the fullness of creation, God's creation coming to its full conclusion. Those things can all sort of be bound up together, and so there can be a lot of conversation around this. But I think my favourite passage we often read at funerals is a passage also from John's Gospel, chapter 14, which has this image: in my Father's house there are many dwelling places, many rooms, one prepared for each of you. That's sort of an image of the afterlife, an image of heaven that we can hold on to. And it's this image of comfort and care. You're being invited into the presence of God. If you want to talk about heaven, that's the best way of describing heaven. It's an eternal presence with God. And so that image of being called into into God's house, the place prepared for you, I think is one that that helps us, I think, and we can act towards it. It gives us comfort and purpose and meaning. I'm sure there were other things I was going to say, but I'll leave it there.
Right, so we're now up to, we've got 10 minutes for questions and answers. I have no idea how one pulls this one. Very easy. Wow. Learn something. So it would be better for the people who are going to listen on YouTube if when you ask your question, you do so with the microphone. So if you put up your hand, I can bring the microphone and you can indicate which of the speakers or all of the speakers that you wish to answer.
Behave yourselves.
Thanks, Naomi. Thank you, all three, for your wonderful summaries of these practices. I have two questions, and I guess each of you can kind of choose both or choose one that speaks to you. But one is, what does your tradition say about suicide? And then the next question might be a little lighter. There's this Jewish woman who I believe is mentioned in the Quran more than in the Christian scriptures. And I'm wondering what your tradition says about Mary, mother of Jesus. So I'd love to hear all of you guys respond to that. Thanks.
Okay, who would like to go first?
Pass along that.
Okay, suicide, it's interesting, we were having conversations about that earlier with my friends. So, I mean, Islam has a strong stance on suicide in the sense that the life that God has given, the belief is that only God can take that life. Having said that, there's an understanding and realization that someone who is suicidal or commits suicide may not be in a mental state where they're really making a rational decision. So, again, it's as human beings, we are instructed not to judge people. We don't know what's going through someone's heart. You don't know what's going through their mind. So therefore you hope that you pray for them. But I guess Islam does make it clear that suicide is not allowed. But remembering that just because someone's committed suicide, you wouldn't distance yourself from that person or their family. I hope that makes sense, that distinguishing factor. Okay, the second question about Mary, the mother of Jesus. There's actually a chapter in the Quran that's named after her, Maryam. So she's one of the most revered women in Islam. There's details about her conception, as a virgin, and the miraculous birth of Jesus as from the Islamic tradition without a father. And in the Quran it goes into a lot of focus on her as a person, which I'm quite fascinated by, about the challenges that she went through. Coming into a community, being pregnant with no father, it's not easy. So it really speaks very highly of her, and she's very much revered in Islam. But also, in a way, to me, it highlights that being a single parent is nothing to be ashamed of. We have a lot of single mothers today, but when you think about it, Virgin Mary was a single mother in this worldly domain. So, she's very much revered.
On the subject of suicide, I think I just want to say, just to a lot of what you said, thank you. I think you encapsulated that really well. Look, our tradition expressly forbade for many years taking the funeral of someone who had suicided. They couldn't be buried in a church graveyard. The priest couldn't take the funeral. They were cut out. I guess so. In a sense, the view that they had murdered themselves and murder wasn't appropriate, for the reasons which I think you but I'm really glad that view of I think in church and society together have shifted that view. it's a moment of huge grief, and we need to support families. We need to hold on to and celebrate all that was positive in this person's life. And part of our mourning is that we see the loss of that potential and mourn their loss. In terms of Mary, look, I think that can swing wildly for probably historic reasons within Christianity. Obviously, she's absolutely a courageous young woman who, look, we're talking about life cycles tonight, saw the whole of that life cycle in her lifetime in relation to her son in a much shorter period than she would have wanted to. And so she journeys with Jesus and witnesses and is part of all of that. And facing all that challenges and the huge courage that she showed and the huge tenacity in terms of being able to fulfill God's call of her life. I guess historically within the church, because in more Protestant churches sort of the push against what has been seen as Catholic, and particularly the Catholic view of Mary, has meant that more Protestant churches tend to sort of push her to the side, and that's probably more about not wanting to be Catholic than about Mary herself. But I think we're probably emerging out of that and look at Mary as one of the key saints of our church, and her life is to be celebrated and looked to.
Judaism traditionally holds the belief that the body belongs to God. Contemporary Jewish ethicist Rabbi Elliot Dorff uses a real estate metaphor for that. He says that our bodies are more like a rented flat than they are like a house that we've bought. We've rented them from God, and therefore you can't move a wall just because you want to, and you need permission even to paint. And that is one of the reasons that certain practices like tattooing are frowned upon, but certainly suicide as well. Even so, even as the Jewish tradition has frowned on suicide, it has also sought at every turn to be as lenient as possible, which is to say, and this example is cited in the literature, that if someone was seen high up on a roof and then is found on the pavement below, we can assume that they fell. We give them the benefit of the doubt. And in today's psychological world, we understand that sometimes death by suicide is the end result of a long process of illness. A suite of illnesses that we sometimes may include depression, although certainly depression does not, far from, always end in suicide. And so we understand it now as a medical condition rather than as a moral one. I don't have anything to say about Mary, and that's because our canon was closed hundreds of years before she was born. So I'll just take this moment to add one more thing that I should have said when talking about what happens after we die. I didn't acknowledge that there is a significant group of Jews through time who have believed in bodily resurrection of themselves as an individual at the end of times or when Messiah comes. And that's part of the reason why we traditionally don't cremate. Because first of all, the body belongs to God, and it's a flat, not a house, so it's not ours to do with in that way, but also we may need it at some point, according to some strands of Judaism.
Somebody else?
Thank you. My name is Ian, and I grew up from a Christian perspective. One of the things I love, and I've got to think of the question I'm going to ask when I'm saying this. One of the things I love reading the Old Testament is there's very much from the Jewish perspective, it's about the community's relationship with God. And I just want to know from our three speakers, as society becomes more individualistic, does that change also reflect changes within your faiths, or are they still very much a community-based thing with God, or an individual-based faith within each of the religions?
I am going to somewhat disagree with your premise. While certainly Hebrew scripture, and by the way, since we're in a learning mode, Jews don't prefer the title Old Testament. That implies that it's been replaced by something else. So we use Hebrew scripture for that, and Christian scripture for yours. It certainly describes the Jewish people as a group, as an and our travels through the wilderness and through life. But it also tells the stories of individuals and their unique relationships with God. I'm thinking in particular of our central prayer called the Amidah. And at the beginning of the Amidah, we have a phrase, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Leah, Elohei Rachel, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, God of the matriarchs as well. We don't say the one God of all of those people. We say that each one of them had their own unique and idiosyncratic relationship to God, saw and understood God differently because of who they were as individuals. So the individual spiritual experience is absolutely enshrined in Jewish practice.
You know, I think that's where you're coming from. I think the point about, you know, we probably need to think some of this through more, but the importance of community, and community remains important. I agree with your point about celebrating the individual, but churches, part of what's really important is we're the body of Christ, we're the gathering of the faithful. We see the importance not just of my life, but I see the importance of your life. I see the importance of my neighbour. It's important to view my neighbour and look after my neighbour. And I think I think I'm hearing your commentary on particularly Western society, which has moved far more towards me looking after myself and my family, perhaps not so much worried about the person next door, let alone down the street. There might be some conversation about the extent of that, but I think that's certainly part of what challenges their faith communities. Certainly as a church, people have less time on their hands. People are working harder and longer, and the rat race is alive and well, and people have less time to engage in community, and I think that's a practical challenge to churches, to rugby clubs, to people joining the PTA at school, and I think that is something that as faith communities we do find ourselves talking about a lot, is the need to try and hold on to that and ignite that and encourage that to get people to look to one another and to have that sense of community, because we are all in this together in that sense.
I definitely think that in the Western world, individualism is a big growing issue. In probably other areas like Asia, it's not so much yet. There's a lot of incentives in Islam to try to keep the community together. I say the word incentive because I'll give you some examples. For example, praying 5 times a day, Muslims pray 5 times a day, or they're meant to. If you pray at the mosque, you get 27 times more rewards. It's a sacred place, that's one thing. But, the fact that you're going to see other people at the mosque is, that becomes an incentive. Muslims are expected to do Hajj if they have the wealth and the health to do so, pilgrimage to Mecca. There's like 2.5 million people there at Hajj, I think the last Hajj. So again, although it's a very personal worship, doing the pilgrimage, it's a huge collective as well. Giving charity also, you have to give 2.5% of your wealth to the poor. To do that, you need to know where the poor is. You need to know who they identify them, and therefore you need to know the community. So there's all these kinds of, incentives or, opportunities created to form that community, to be part of that community. Talking about the neighbours, one of the companions of the Prophet said the Prophet spoke so highly about the rights about the neighbours that I almost thought they would be able to inherit from us. So it was the rights of the neighbours were so important. So there is a lot there to try to keep that community together. But whether today's
Jummah, Ramadan.
Jamal, okay, this time Jamal, like the Friday prayer, it's all about the congregation coming together, and then also, during Ramadan, even, the iftars, breaking of the fast together, there's just a lot there, but whether it can counter that individualistic society that we're going to, time will tell.
I think we've run out of time. I'm sorry, we've run out of time for questions now, but do talk to our speakers afterwards. The next thing is I'd like to invite Judith Marks to come and give the thank you speech.
Hello everybody. On behalf of the Beth Shalom community, I would like to express our thanks to Zalea, Archdeacon Michael and Rabbi Dean for their informative, insightful and compassionate discussions on religious practices of each faith on their life cycle events. While there may be similarities, it has also been enlightening and fascinating to learn of each other's customs and rituals. Thanks also to the Pearl of the Islands Foundation. Thanks also to the Pearl of the Islands Foundation and the Holy Trinity Cathedral for their help in putting together this event. We also like to thank the Astor Foundation, who has given funding for some technical costs. As we make our way through our own life's journey, the knowledge and understanding of each faith, special practices, can only enrich all our lives and create tolerance and acceptance. And talking of which, I would like to give each of our speakers a certificate from the Trees That Count, and it is for the planting of 3 native trees in your honour and appreciation of the time you have given us tonight. So first of all, thank you so much. Also, thank you, Naomi, for facilitating this evening's discussion. We know how tirelessly you work for the interfaith. Our supper tonight includes a very special treat, which is to be prepared by Patisse from the Pearl of the Islands, and we are going to enjoy your Noah's pudding, I believe. So that sounds rather fun. And thank you again to all of those who helped set up for tonight and advertise our supper. And thank you for being our guests in our own supper.
We must also thank the Holy Trinity Cathedral who have lent us the camera tonight. Bit of a backstory on it, but it is, we are using one of your cameras. I'd like to invite Nazife Bassar up to tell us what Noah's pudding actually is. Not everyone is sure.
Shalom. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I stand before you to share the delightful tale of Noah's pudding, also known as Ashura, a tradition deeply rooted in Turkish culture and Islamic history. This beloved dessert carries with a powerful message of unity, compassion, and shared humanity. Legend has it that when Noah's Ark finally found rest on Mount Ararat in Turkey, after the Great Flood subsided, Noah's family celebrated this momentous occasion with a special dish. With their supplies nearly depleted, they gathered whatever grains, nuts, fruit they had left and put them together, creating what we now know as Noah's pudding or Ashura. Throughout the generation, this sweet concoction has evolved into more than just a dessert. It has become a symbol of unity, an essential bond between humans and their Creator. Every year, on the 10th day of the Islamic month of Muharram, which was Saturday, marking the day of Ashura, Muslim, especially Turkish people, share this delightful treat with friends, relatives, neighbors, and anyone in their social circle. Ashura holds a special significance in Islamic tradition, as it commemorates various important events in the history of mankind, from the creation of Adam and Eve to deliverance of Prophet Moses and his people from Pharaoh tyranny. This day serves as reminder of the resilience and determination of the human spirit. The name Ashura itself holds a profound meaning. It signifies the prohibition of all forms of violence and fighting, reflecting the dessert's ingredients devoid of any animal products. It is a statement against violence and bloodshed, emphasizing the values of peace and compassion that lie at the core of this tradition. Beyond cultural and religious boundaries, sharing food has always been a powerful way to bring people together. Ashura offers a beautiful opportunity to reaffirm our unity and interconnectedness, regardless of our individual faith, backgrounds, and beliefs. By sharing this pudding, we express our love, aloha, and respect for one another, fostering a sense of community and understanding. In the spirit of this cherished tradition, I would like to extend our gratitude thanks to Hatice for who prepared this delicious Noah's pudding. Let this sweet treat serve as a reminder of the power of sharing, love, and compassion in a world that often needs a little more of each. May we all embrace the values of Ashura and strive to build a more harmonious and inclusive society. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou.
So it's our good fortune that this event coincides with this festival. And it's not the first time that Noah's pudding has been enjoyed in this hall. Nazife brought it quite a few years ago, but our members have long memories of how delicious it actually is. So I'm going to invite you to stay for supper. Just going to ask a few logistical things. So if the Beth Shalom members could stack the chairs, please, so that there'll be room for people to move around. You're welcome to have a look in our synagogue, but please, no food or drink to go inside. But do have a good look while you're here. So thank you for coming along tonight and being part of this most interesting Children of Abraham event. I also would like to thank Stephanie Markson, who took the lead on organising